When I grow up, I want to be an executioner. This was the wish a 10-year-old British boy, Albert Pierrepoint, left in a school essay at the beginning of the last century. Years would pass, and the boy's dream would come true. He would execute hundreds of people, including serial killers, Nazi criminals, and even his best friend. But what made Albert Pierrepoint choose such a specific profession in his childhood? According to psychiatrists, executioners are typically people with special inclinations. They're either psychopaths, people completely devoid of emotion, conscience, or compassion, perfect killers, so to speak, or they're traumatized people with sadistic tendencies who can only derive pleasure from torturing someone or inflicting pain. So, there is a certain predisposition. However, in Albert Pierrepoint's case, the boy simply had no other choice. He knew perfectly well what an execution was from a young age. After all, his father and his own uncle were professional performers of death sentences. Therefore, Pierrepoint, like many famous executioners, simply continued the family business. Existence determines consciousness. After all, a child is drawn into this from a young age. He doesn't have that kind of revulsion. It's just like a butcher's child, for instance. His dad takes him to the shop, they butcher something. It's also related to the fact that there were specific guilds, right? No one else would teach you another profession except your relatives. If you want it, you inherit it. If you don't, you could be kicked out of the family and told, live by your own wits then, if you're so smart and don't plan to learn the trade. They were left with no choice. The most famous executioner in Italy, Giovanni Battista Bugatti, was also a hereditary performer of death sentences. Over his 65-year career, from the late 18th century to the mid-19th century, he executed 516 people. He started with axes and clubs and ended with the guillotine. He often referred to his charges as patience, and he was nicknamed the Master of Justice. Perhaps the most famous dynasty of executioners in Europe was the Parisian Sanson family. 6 generations of death sentence performers came from it. For a century and a half, they carried out sentences. One of the most famous executioners from this dynasty executed Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, as well as the revolutionaries Robespierre, Danton, and Saint-Just. This executioner was Charles Henry Sanson. In his lifetime, he carried out 2,918 executions. According to legend, the French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte once asked Sanson how he slept after killing so many people. The bold reply followed, "If kings and dictators sleep soundly, then why should an executioner's conscience bother him?" The last representative of the Parisian dynasty of execution specialists was Henry Clement Sanson. In 1847, he was unable to carry out a death sentence because he had pawned his guillotine to a moneylender for his debts. In the end, the hapless executioner was dismissed in disgrace. But Albert Pierrepoint left the profession voluntarily. He became a legend in his own lifetime. He was called the most efficient executioner in Great Britain. According to official records, Pierrepoint hanged 435 people during his career, and according to unconfirmed reports, more than 600. It's rare to find people who, while performing the duties of an executioner, would also publicize it, right? But Albert Pierrepoint also became a media personality, not hiding it, but on the contrary, even eagerly talking about his line of work. The career of Great Britain's most efficient executioner began in 1932, when Albert Pierrepoint was 27 years old. At first, he assisted his uncle Thomas at executions, and after his retirement, carried out death sentences on his own. It was the very case where the student surpassed the teacher. Albert Pierrepoint became a true master of his craft. He perfected the process of hanging the condemned. Before an execution, he would always visit the person in their cell the day before the execution to find out their height and weight in order to choose a rope of the appropriate length and strength. He came to this conclusion based on his overall experience. If the rope is too short, the person will die a long and agonizing death by suffocation, and that death will drag on for a long time and cause the person torment. But if the rope is too long, it will break the person's cervical vertebrae, and he won't die instantly, but will die an agonizing death in torment. Thanks to such a conscientious approach to his work, Albert Pierrepoint became the most sought-after executioner in England. Many condemned to death literally dreamed that he would be the one to carry out their sentence. It was, after all, an almost 100% guarantee of being spared pre-death torment. He holds several records related to the execution of a person. He holds the record for the most people executed in a single day. He executed 27 people in one day. On average, one execution took him 15 seconds, from the moment he entered the cell to the doctor's confirmation of death of the person he executed. That's 15 seconds. But the fastest execution he performed lasted 7 seconds. That is, he entered the cell, executed the person, and death was recorded 7 seconds later. Worldwide fame came to Albert Pierrepoint after the end of World War II, when the Britain was tasked with executing Nazi criminals. In 4 years, he carried out 202 death sentences from the Nuremberg trials. The executioner hung SS officers, concentration camp guards, and British collaborators. As Pierrepoint claimed, he was unwittingly involved even in the death of Adolf Hitler's official successor, Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring. According to his belief, Hermann Göring suicided after learning that he would be hanged not by Pierrepoint, but by some inept American. Pierrepoint was a celebrity. Journalists wrote about him, calling him the Angel of Vengeance. Albert Pierrepoint didn't fit the image of an executioner at all. He was affable, friendly, and had an excellent sense of humor. In between executions, the Angel of Vengeance worked as a clerk in a grocery store. He was short, balding, loved to give children rides on his pony, loved to tell jokes and sing songs in the pub. He was always the life of the party, and no one ever saw him without a tie. In 1950, Albert Pierrepoint experienced a personal drama. His best friend, James Corbett, was arrested on charges of murdering his lover. The court sentenced him to the highest form of punishment. To spare his friend from pre-death suffering, Pierrepoint himself volunteered to carry out the sentence. Later, in his memoirs, the executioner confessed, the execution of his best friend became the most terrible ordeal of his life. He published a book, an autobiographical book of memoirs, Executioner, a short title, but an understandable one. He published it in 1974. It is probably one of the few memoir books by an executioner. Towards the end of his career, the British executioner became disillusioned with the death penalty. In his memoirs, he wrote that the forcible taking of a person's life by a court verdict does not help reduce the crime rate. Albert Pierrepoint retired in 1956, and 8 years later, Great Britain abolished the death penalty.